No, really, it does. Some striking images there. And if you're a poet or even just a fan, 3,000-year-old poems are interesting, don't you think? A silver cord, the golden bowl broken. What does that mean? I don't know. And that's just scratching the surface. I could make this whole channel about biblical poetry and I'd have enough content for the next 10 years. So, the Bible has poetry. What else does it have? Did Nebuzaradan really exist? He did. Did the fall of Jerusalem happen on the date given in the second book of Kings? It did. Are the people who say the Bible is all made up talking out of their butts? They are. Which is not to say that there's archaeological proof for everything in Scripture. But then again, there wouldn't be, would there? After all, what is the archaeological evidence for the American Revolution? The invention of the jet engine. Your first date. So the Bible has poetry, and it has history. It also has philosophy. What's Paul talking about here? He's observing his nature and noticing how it clashes with his expectations. This is a question philosophers call the theory of self. And that's just one of the philosophical questions the Bible addresses. What's interesting about the philosophies in the Bible is that the basic questions are framed in a completely different way than the philosophical framework of our own tradition, which comes from the Greeks. Even though the philosophers of Greece and the prophets and wise men of ancient Israel were basically a short sea voyage apart, and also in reach of each other over land, they thought completely differently. And that means that the Bible gives us a completely fresh perspective on the basic questions of philosophy, as long as you understand that that perspective is there. As long as you don't try to impose your own culture onto the culture of Scripture. The Bible has philosophy, it has poetry, it has history. This makes it interesting, worth reading. But it's got more than that. The Bible is, how shall I say, well situated. If you look at a map, you can see that the Levant is like a conduit connecting 3 continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. And ancient peoples of all 3 continents interact and influence one another right through the pages of the Bible. Objectively, this makes the Levant a very interesting place. It's been said geography is destiny, but it's not just geography that makes the Bible significant. The Bible gives us a window into a critical period of ancient history, something called the Bronze Age collapse. In the centuries before the rise of the Kingdom of Israel, 3 separate long-standing empires fell apart. Babylon to the east, the Hittites to the northwest, and Egypt to the southwest. Ever since the discovery of the Bronze Age collapse, scholars have been debating what role the ancient Hebrews played in these events. The Bible gives us perspective on these questions. And actually, the Bronze Age collapse gives us perspective on the Bible. But it's not just geography and timing that make the Bible well situated. It's also ethnography. What do I mean by that? Imagine with me for a moment that half of the people living in the ancient East were a completely different species than the one you and I belong to. Or better yet, imagine we had proof that human-shaped aliens permeated the ancient world. Okay, are we on one of those kind of channels? Bear with me here. These aliens were competitors with the people we know and are familiar with in archaeology and ancient history. The Egyptians, peoples of Anatolia, Syria, Babylon, and so on. Imagine that the clay tablets and papyri of these familiar civilizations repeatedly described shadowy beings who dwelt just beyond the edge of their territory. Resourceful, strange, dangerous, sometimes raiding, sometimes trading, sometimes conquering the kingdoms we know about. They had different religions, different cultures and languages, and a different social structure. And this means that they thought differently. I'm of course talking about the nomadic peoples of the ancient world. Trotting out that word nomad, you might feel a little let down. Nomads in our time are the destitute minority of an industrialized world. Gypsies, Bedouin, Grateful Dead fans. Small bands of colorful wanderers vulnerable to the oppression of our industrialized political and military systems. Of course, this is our perspective, our bias, and it's true. In our world, economic and military dominance is the dividend of staying in one place and living in one place. But the ancient world was another story entirely. And you don't have to go back that far. In the 12th century, the Mongols burst out of the steppes of Central Asia and laid waste to every kingdom they encountered. They conquered China, wiped out the Abbasid Empire in the Middle East, decimated Byzantium, and enslaved Old Russia. They threatened Europe with total annihilation. Central Asian nomads with bows, felt huts, and incredibly tough horses. The Mongols established the largest empire the world had ever seen, and that was less than 1,000 years ago. If you go back far enough, the nomads are, in fact, the majority of human beings on the planet. Not always as powerful as the Mongols were, but a match, and at times more than a match, for the ancient kingdoms of the historical record. And the farther back you go, the more nomads you find. I said you and I are descended from settled peoples, and that's true, but we're also descended from the nomads. Nomadism is, in fact, the original survival strategy of the human species. So we have them in our family, but we don't know them. What I mean is, those people didn't leave us the kind of records that the settled peoples left us. No texts, no king lists, no monuments and ruins. Even the languages, in many cases, are lost. In some cases, we only know that there was a tribe in a particular area that was called by a name that may or may not have meant anything to them. And that fact demolishes the idea that the history we have adequately describes the human past. Yes, we have a record, but it's one-sided. We only know half the story, and everyone in that half assumes their story is the only one worth telling. But what would our conception of history look like if we could open a window onto the other half of antiquity, to see the kingdoms of the ancients from an external and perhaps a more detached perspective? What if we could walk with the ancient nomads themselves? Well, we can. At least in one place. The Hebrews of ancient Israel had a way of thinking, of spirituality, and of life that set them apart from every other human group on the planet. Genetically, the ancient Hebrews belonged to a well-attested Semitic lineage, both settled and nomadic. But culturally, it's like the Hebrews were from another planet. Take religion. Peoples of the walled cities acquired gods like a fairgrounds acquires attractions, and for the same reason. More to see, more to do, more money for us. Give the people what they want, up to and including child sacrifice. The Hebrews totally rejected that mentality. They also rejected what they saw as a depraved social hierarchy based on fraud. But unlike the vast majority of ancient nomads, who may or may not have shared any of these attitudes, the Hebrews wrote down what they thought. Did ancient nomads actually write things down? I thought writing was only something that settled peoples did. No, actually, the ancient Hebrews did write things down for themselves. And by the way, they weren't the only nomads to do so. But that's another story. The Bible is the cultural record of a people totally different than any other group that existed anywhere on the planet. That in itself makes this an extraordinary book. But of course, we see through the passing chapters how the Hebrews came in time to intermarry with the settled peoples and ultimately to embrace every facet of their religion. We watch as they transition from nomadic pastoralists to a settled nation with a capital city, an army, a dynasty of kings, and a religion that gradually admits more and more gods, until the Hebrews reach the point where they have betrayed the original nomadic way of life. And then they learn the hard way what comes of such a betrayal. And in the misery of aftermath and exile, their holy men, the Hebrew prophets, conceived of something unique and entirely new. Messiah, the most compelling idea in the history of ideas. Jesus of Nazareth is why the Bible is with us. Before the gospel, the writings of the ancient Hebrews had significance only to their descendants, the Judeans. After Jesus, the entire Bible had significance for the entire world. From a scientific and intellectual perspective, the Bible is easy to dismiss. Miracles, legends, a cosmology that seems frankly painfully outdated. Historical claims that even believers have to admit are sometimes impossible to verify. And if you want, you can use these problems to discredit and dismiss the human species' all-time bestseller, as long as you admit the basic intellectual dishonesty of doing so. You see, there are rules to knowledge. And one of those rules is, when confronted by a document from another culture, you must understand that culture in order to understand the document. And if that document comes from a lost civilization, a non-Western, very ancient Middle Eastern civilization with a completely unique conception of reality, then you have to recover that reality before you can weigh that document. But if you want to dismiss the Bible on your own terms, that is to say, on the basis of 21st century culture, you can do so. But if you are going to argue from ignorance, it's probably better not to read it. Because of course, if you do read it, you'll learn. I could talk about the cultural influence of the Bible, the whole corpus of Western art, music, the influence of Scripture on the Protestant Reformation, and then the Scientific Revolution, through to the Enlightenment, and then democracy, right down to the buzzword of our own culture, progress. Things getting better over time because we notice injustice and advocate for social change. Where did that deal get started? Progress is what gives our history meaning, as opposed to someone who thinks time goes in circles, a cyclical wheel controlled by a God who gives no commands and will hear no petitions. If you're a member of Western civilization and you think history has a point, the Bible is the reason, whether you've read it or not. And if you're skeptical whether the Bible has any influence over our conception of history and of time, take a look at the date the next time you check the date. It's hard to overstate the influence of Scripture on Western civilization when you think about it. But this is the obvious point to make. Yes, Michelangelo certainly painted the Bible, but he didn't understand it. Neither did Da Vinci, or Shakespeare, or Kepler, or Locke. All of these people thought of Scripture under the assumption that the Bible is a theological work that belongs to Western civilization. And if the Bible had been written in Europe by bishops and cardinals, they would be right. But it wasn't, and they aren't. The sacred art and literature of Christian Europe is genuinely great, but it isn't biblical in the sense of being a part of the culture of Scripture. If we're going to be honest about our historical perspective, then we have to recognize that these great works are several degrees removed from the time, place, language, and culture of the Judeo-Christian Scriptures. Today, thanks to the categories of thought given to us by history and anthropology, we can see clearly that the Bible is the product of a lost civilization. Actually, a lost civilization within a lost civilization. And that makes the voice of this book totally unique. Like a profound but baffling novel, it must be understood on its own terms if the Bible is to be fairly weighed and judged. And this really brings us to point 7. The more you read it, the more you realize this is true. Yet, at the same time, it is undeniably part of our world. On the surface, very familiar, too familiar, but only on the surface. Like a Bengal tiger in a cage at the circus. Wow, a Bengal tiger, just like the photos. Where is Bengal? Not sure. What's it like? Don't know. Because it is the all-time bestseller of the human species, and yet is almost never read, even by the people who claim to believe in it, the Bible has become fodder in the American culture war. The Bible is a fairy tale. Christianity is child abuse, and Christians are psychopaths. Did I say that out loud? Actually, America is the fulfillment of the gospel. We're going to bomb those brown children because Jesus. We're going to burn this city down when we protest tonight because Jesus. Jesus would approve my trans sex theory. Agree or I'll cancel you. Hate the haters, like Jesus said. Join my party, like Jesus said. Do what I say, not what I do, because Jesus. It's a good thing we have these people to read the Bible for us, don't you think? What would happen if we read it for ourselves?